Yo, welcome back everybody to a brand new video here on the second channel. It's been a while since I've done one of these videos. We're going to be doing a top 10 best decks in the format right now for May 2024. Of course, the Indianapolis Regionals is this weekend, so I thought it'd be a good time to look at what are the top 10 best decks in the format currently right now heading in to Indianapolis. Now, Indianapolis is going to be the largest tournament ever. I think it's going to be even bigger than Orlando Regionals, which was already the biggest tournament. So hopefully, if you're confused on what to play, or you don't know what you want to play, or you don't really have a grasp on where the meta is right now, hopefully this video helps you out. I haven't done one of these videos in a while where I rank the 10 best decks in the format, but I thought it'd be time to do it once again for the Indianapolis Regionals. If y'all are going to go on to enjoy the video, make sure to leave a like on the video if you enjoy these top 10 videos, and make sure to subscribe down below here to the second channel if you haven't already. We're on the road to 14,000 subscribers, and I think without further ado, let's get into the top 10. And at the number 10 spot, we have Iron Hands. Now, Iron Hands definitely has fallen down a little bit in terms of the ranking, mainly because I think the deck is very strong. It can be very annoying to play against, but I ultimately think that its bad matchup against Charizard is what holds it back. Now, it does have decent matchups across the board. It has a good Lugia matchup. I think its Ancient Box matchup is pretty close too, and I also think that it has a decent Shampow matchup. But other than that, I think this deck does struggle a little bit into a lot of other meta decks, and definitely has a very rough time against Charizard. I think if you're going to take a bad matchup against Charizard, it's not a good thing. Even some of the decks outside of the top 10, which we'll get into later, also can beat this deck. Future Hands definitely is a strong deck still, and I wouldn't count the deck out just because it's at number 10 on this list. Doesn't mean the deck is dead or anything. I just think that what really holds it back is that rough Charizard matchup. And with Charizard being, well, everywhere right now, it's really tough to take an L to that deck. But Iron Hands definitely is still a strong deck that can beat a lot of the other decks in the meta that are trying to beat Charizard specifically. And at number 9, we have Lugia V-Star. Now, Lugia V-Star is definitely a very powerful deck when it gets going. My main issue with the deck, and what really holds it back, really is just the fact that it's a very inconsistent deck sometimes. You get those classic Lugia hands where you got, like, 6 energy and a Minccino, and you're just like, well, what am I supposed to do with this? But Lugia is a very good deck when it does set up. When you get the Archeops out, when you're summoning starring, and you're just kind of doing your thing, this deck is very hard to beat. It's actually almost unstoppable, especially when you have Cinccino. I think this deck does have an okay matchup against Charizard, though if you are playing against Charizard with Hero's Cape, it does get a little bit tougher, but your Zard matchup isn't too bad, and Lugia is just a very powerful deck when it sets up. Now, it does have one other big issue, and that is the fact that it does lose to a lot of the decks that utilize Iron Hands EX. So, of course, this deck doesn't have the greatest Shampow matchup. Its matchup against Lost Box isn't fantastic either sometimes. And, of course, your Future Hands matchup is pretty bad too. Now, Future Hands, like I said, it's kind of slipping a little bit in the meta. I don't think it's as good as it used to be. And, well, Shampow is still very strong, and Lost Box is definitely good too. I think Lugia can still be a very formidable deck regardless of where it stands right now with different Iron Hands decks being popular. Lugia is still just a very strong deck, and it doesn't really matter sometimes what you're playing against because Lugia can just set up and roll your opponent very easily. And I think Lugia is in a decent spot right now heading into Indianapolis. Next up, at number 8, is the Roaring Moon Dunsparce deck. Now, this deck has been getting pretty consistent top 8s, and probably I can see it keep getting top 8s at these tournaments as it just keeps getting there. The deck is very strong. You have 2 very good attackers with both Roaring Moons being very useful. The 1-prize Roaring Moon and, of course, the 2-prize Roaring Moon. This deck does have decent matchups across the board. I do think your Zard matchup is fairly close. Zard can still beat you, obviously, but your Zard matchup isn't too terrible. Mainly, one of the things this deck can do really well is it can control your board. You can control your board state with how many Pokemon you have in play in terms of your prize trade. You can either have a 1-prize board, or sometimes you can put the Roaring Moon down to take a big knockout when your opponent puts a 2-prizer down. And that's one of the things that does make the Roaring Moon Dunsparce so strong. It does have some consistency issues. Obviously, you're relying very heavily on your Greninja not being prized. You're using Sawdas to bail you out to power up your moons. The deck definitely can be a little bit slow. I know you have the Dunsparce in the deck for the extra bit of consistency, but sometimes the deck can get some pretty awkward draws. But the deck is very strong. I do think that we are going to continue to see the deck do well. So very straightforward deck, in my opinion, with what it's trying to do. And if you're somebody who wants to just play something that's just very fun, high roll, and just kind of can run the opponent over with the Double Moon, I definitely recommend trying out Double Roaring Moon. All right, and at the number 7 spot is Ancient Box. Now, in my opinion, I think that Ancient Box is a stronger deck right now than the Roaring Moon Dunsparce deck. I think that Royal Moon Dunsparce is also very good, but I think Ancient Box is slightly better, mainly because it does have better matchups across the board compared to Royal Moon. For starters, this deck has a really good time into decks like Shampow and into the Lost Zone archetypes. This deck can be very, very powerful into those decks, specifically having the ability to do so much damage really quickly with your Roaring Moon. You do have the Flutter Mane, which can be very annoying for those decks to deal with. The Koraidon is really good. This is the Jake Ewert list from Orlando Regionals that did get second place. Does have the Great Tusk in the deck, which I have been seeing a lot of the Ancient Box decks now using the Great Tusk. The Great Tusk can be very useful in matchups too, can be nice into Charizard. Then of course you have the Fire Energy in the deck. Now I don't know if you need to play Fire going forward. Nobody really plays Noivern or anything. It's mainly just there so that Koraidon can shred through the wall Pokemon, but nobody's playing any walls right now, in my opinion. So I do think that Ancient Box, it probably just needs to play like a Cobalion right now in order to stand up to the Charizard matchup, and that's ultimately this deck's worst matchup, or at least your hardest matchup is going to be Charizard. Charizard is tricky, mainly because they just have so much health. They have the Turo. They can be very hard to deal with. But I think that Royal Moon Ancient Box definitely is a very powerful deck. And just being an all one prize deck can be very good right now, because not many decks right now can really say that they are just all one prizers and can beat the opponent down much like this. This deck's other bad matchup, I guess, is also Espathra. But Espathra, well, it is definitely, gaining some traction right now. It's not really a deck that I would say you have to look out for specifically. But I do think that Ancient Box is very good. Honestly, if I was going to Indianapolis, I would consider running back Ancient Box again, because I played at Orlando. I really enjoyed the deck, and I think it's still a strong play for Indianapolis. And at number 6, we have Artina. Now, Artina is one of the most straightforward decks you can play right now, and it also has a pretty solid time against Charizard as long as you get to play the game. Now, you are playing an Arceus deck, meaning you are going to need that Arc Energy attachment turn 1 in order for the deck to really function. But the deck does have a lot of power behind it. You have the Arceus V-Star and the Judge combo, which can be very good early game against Charizard. You have the Giratina V-Star with Maximum Belt, which can be good against Pidgeot and Charizard. And then, of course, you have the Iron Leaves EX, which can come in and knock out a Charizard EX in one hit. This deck has a pretty solid matchup against Charizard. It has one of the better Charizard matchups right now out of most decks in the format. And that's one of the things that Artina does have going for it. This deck is extremely powerful when it gets going. It does have its rough matchups, though. Obviously, your matchup against something like Lugia isn't very good. And I also think that your CPAP matchup can be a little shaky, and your Lost Tina matchup isn't fantastic either. Now, I think the main way that Artina's seen a lot of play right now with is just playing Lost Cities in the deck. Lost City does help fix your Ancient Box matchup, which was another pretty bad matchup before Lost City was discovered, because Ancient Box does run you over pretty quickly. Your matchup against Royal Moon Dunsparce isn't very good either, or at least it's a little bit weaker. And then, of course, your CPOW matchup also, in my opinion, wasn't that great, because even if you were to go Maximum Belt KO once Shampow, they would respond KO you, and even though you have a Giratina powered up, you can knock out their response Shampow, but then how you KO in that third Shampow, a lot of the time it was hard to do that. Now that we have Lost City in the deck, Artina can just go after the Baxcaliburs aggressively, removing 2 of them from play, making it impossible for Shampow to play the game, basically. That's how Artina operates right now, and I do think that this deck is very strong in the meta. It does have some awkward matchups. Like I said, your Lost Tina matchup and your Lugia matchup aren't fantastic, but your other matchups are good, and it does have a fairly strong Charizard matchup. Of course, things have to go your way. You got to go first. You got to get that Arc Energy turn 1. But if you can accomplish all that, which really isn't that hard to do, Artina is a very aggressive and powerful deck. And sometimes you can just win the game by just judging your opponent into nothing for a couple turns. And that alone can just win you games sometimes just off of judge. But yeah, Artina is very strong right now. Very straightforward and simple deck. Definitely a deck that does also boast a solid matchup against Charizard. And at number 5, we have Lost Box. Lost Box has gained a lot of traction recently, and that's mainly thanks to its second place finish at the Sao Paulo Regional Championships, which this deck definitely does boast a pretty good matchup into Charizard, or at least it should have a good matchup into Charizard. You have a lot of different ways to beat Charizard. You have the Royal Moon, you have Raikou to take out Pidgeot, you have the Mew EX in late game, you have the Iron Hands, you have Greninja early on, and you have Sableye too. Sometimes Charizard can really struggle to deal with all of these different threats in one match. Now, you do struggle into certain variants of Charizard, not just like the most straightforward Charizard. Some versions of Charizard can be very difficult for Lost Box to handle. We'll talk about that a little bit later in the bad matchups category, but I do think that Lost Box is very strong, mainly because of all the options you have. You have so many different attackers, and you have different attackers for different situations. Now, Lost Box isn't perfect. Well, it does have the power of Mirage Gate, getting that turn 2 Mirage Gate into turn 2 Greninja, turn 2 Hands, even something like a turn 2 Royal Moon, sometimes even turn 2 Sableye if you're really, really lucky. This deck can be very hard to deal with when it pops off like that, though it does have its fair share of awkward matchups. I think that your CPOW matchup is a little awkward Something like your Artina matchup can be a little sketchy too, mainly because sometimes you can just lose to like a really bad Judge or an Iono. And then, of course, you do have a bit of an awkward matchup into Ancient Box. Another matchup that kind of just beats down Lost Box pretty easily is Ancient Box. Ancient Box is a very tricky matchup for the Lost Box deck to handle. And then ultimately, while you do have a good Zard matchup, the one Zard matchup that is very tricky is the Eerie Regieleki Charizard deck. That deck has the ability to run you out of Mirage Gates very quickly. If they are able to sit there with Eerie and Regieleki, a lot of the time the Regieleki is very difficult to deal with because it has 130 HP. You're forced to sometimes Iron Bundle them, or you're forced into awkward positions where you have to KO the 2-prizer or try to two-shot them with Cramorant Spit Innocently. And if Charizard can just sit there and use Eerie over and over, it can be tough. If Charizard is starting to play stuff like Mist Energies and Eerie's, then Lost Box gets a little bit weaker because then you're going to struggle a lot more against Charizard because of stuff like the Mist Energy and the Eerie's, which can be very difficult for this deck to handle. But overall, Lost Box is a very strong deck, very aggressive deck, and it does keep Charizard on their toes. And at number 4, we have Gardevoir. Now, Gardevoir has made a massive resurgence in the format since its top 4 placement at Orlando, and even the fact that it almost got top 8 at EYC has been very kind and good for Gardevoir. Gardevoir definitely is back on the come-up now, and definitely is a very good deck. I mean, it's already in the top 5 here of this ranking, and that's because it actually does have a solid matchup spread across the board. I think that its matchup against Charizard is pretty beatable. If you know how to navigate a Charizard matchup correctly, I think you can beat it. Having access to both Drifloon and Screamtail does give you a lot of power in the Zard matchup. Also, Mimikyu is very good against Charizard too. And then, of course, you have the Flutter Mane in the deck, which can be very good against matchups like the Lost Zone decks, where you can really slow them down. Now, Gardevoir isn't perfect, obviously. It's a little bit slower than it used to be. You no longer have Mirage Step to bail you out. You don't have the Shining Arcana Gardevoir. Sometimes your draw engine can be a little bit flimsy, relying solely on just refinement. And the deck itself does still suffer from some awkward pricing. A lot of the time, you're playing a one of most of your main Pokemon. I have seen modern lists now of Gardevoir start to play 2 copies of Drifloon, especially now that Artina is playing the 3 Lost City. So I've seen 2 Drifloon being a lot more common now, but sometimes you get some awkward pricing, you can have some awkward draws, and like I said, you are a little bit slower than you used to be, relying a little bit more heavily on TM Evolution setting you up. But I do think you have a good matchup spread across the board. I think your worst matchups overall are going to be the Roaring Moon decks. Obviously, Ancient Box and Roaring Moon Dunsparce are probably your 2 worst matchups right now, but I do think that Gardevoir is strong enough to handle most decks in the format, if not every deck in the format right now, except for those 2 Roaring Moon decks that are popular right now. And Gardevoir seems pretty primed to be in a good spot to maybe take down a regionals one day, as it did get top 4, so who knows, maybe Gardevoir is going to run it back in top 8 at Indianapolis. It is a little bit more difficult to pilot, in my opinion, compared to the old version of Gardevoir, where it's a little bit more straightforward with what it was trying to do. Whereas the new version of Gardevoir can be a little bit more trickier to pilot, mainly because there's so many different things you can do in the deck. You got to keep in mind different plays you have with stuff like Flutter Mane, obviously Screamtail and Drifloon being very, very relevant. But Gardevoir is still in the meta, and it's still a very powerful deck right now with a solid Zard matchup. And at number 3, we have Lost Zone Giratina, which definitely is still a very good deck right now, and in my opinion, is one of the best decks to take down Charizard. You have access to Giratina V-Star, which can be very good into both Pidgeot and Charizard with Star Requiem and Lost Impact, and then, of course, you have the Iron Leaves EX, kind of like Artina, but you also have the addition of the Lost Zone engine. You have Sableye, Greninja, which can also be very difficult for Charizard to handle sometimes when they're not able to get Jirachis and Manaphy's out. And Lostina just has a very high power level right now in the format. Roxanne can still be a very strong combo. Now, the big thing with Giratina right now is Mist Energy making a bit of a comeback in Charizard. I do think that Mist Energy is going to be a little bit more popular right now in Charizard going forward, especially in Indianapolis. I can see a lot of the big Charizard decks playing the Mist Energy in it to help counter the Roaring Moons and the Giratinas. And obviously, Giratina can play the Temple of Sinnoh, which does help that matchup a little bit, but I do think that Giratina does have to watch out for the popularity of Mist Energy. But Lostina definitely is still a very powerful deck, and I think that it doesn't really, like, its worst matchup probably will be something like Lugia and Ancient Box. Other than that, I think you can probably beat most other decks in the meta if you play correctly. Giratina can be a bit of a more difficult deck to pilot, especially some of the matchups. I think your Guardy matchup can also be a little bit more interesting. That can be a bit of a puzzling matchup to navigate for sure, but Tina does boast a strong Zard matchup, and sometimes that's all you really need right now is to have a good matchup against something like Charizard. And at the number 2 spot is Shampow. Shampow has a fantastic matchup against Charizard, and that's really all you need to know about playing Shampow right now. It seems to have a good Zard matchup. I think Shampow's Perfect 60 has been discovered right now with the Silene, with the Prime Catcher, with the Canceling Clone, the Double Cipher, the 4 Irida. I think this list for Shampow, the one that Reagan used to get top 4 at Orlando, is probably the best way to play Shampow right now. It's the perfect 60 for the deck. And Shampow does seem to be okay into Zard. Now, obviously, Eerie Zard and Hero's Cape Charizard variants can be a little bit more scarier and harder to deal with, but Shampow just seems to have a good matchup against Zard. You have the Iron Hands, you have Greninja, you have Shampow itself, which can 1-hit KO Charizard consistently. Shampow is a very good deck that just having the ability to abuse all these different attackers that can take 2 prizes every turn with either Greninja or Iron Hands. The Iron Bundle can be very good. The Silene definitely seems to have increased the deck's power level by quite a bit, because you can use Silene to get back your resources, like your retrievals, but you can also use it to use multiple prime catchers within a single game, which is one of the very good things that Shampow has going for it. Ultimately, Shampow's worst matchup is just Ancient Box. Like, literally, I think this deck can beat everything in the meta, except for Ancient Box. I think Ancient Box is easily your hardest matchup right now. I don't know how Shampow can really navigate that matchup or what it can even play to counter something like Ancient Box, but ultimately, if you aren't really scared of Ancient Box, Shampow is a pretty strong play. It does require a lot of sequencing to really pilot this deck, correctly and properly, because it is a very difficult deck to pilot sometimes. But overall, Shampow does have a good Zard matchup, and that's why it's all the way at number 2. So it really does feel like it can beat nearly any deck in the meta right now, except for, really, Ancient Box. Now, before we get into number 1, I do have some honorable mentions that I quickly wanted to name off here. The first one was going to be Asatha. Now, Asatha, weirdly enough, is in a pretty good spot right now. In fact, I would consider putting it at the number 11 spot on the list. Asatha did see a lot more play within Sao Paulo Regionals, and I think a lot of players are saying that this deck does beat Charizard. I don't think it just beats Charizard. Charizard can still beat Asatha, but I do think that Asatha's Zard matchup is a lot closer than most decks right now in the format, mainly because you do force a lot out of Charizard's resources with Asatha's ability, making Charizard require 3 energy to attack it. Having access to the Bayonet is obviously really nice too in those matchups like the Shampow matchup. Bayonet can be very good against Lost Box too, which probably already is an okay matchup. Also, you have a good matchup against Ancient Box, thanks to Asatha's ability being very annoying for that deck to handle. But yeah, Asatha is in a pretty solid position right now, and I wouldn't be surprised if we saw a lot more Asatha at Indianapolis. And then finally, I wanted to give a quick honorable mention to Pidgeot Control. I think Snorlax Stall definitely has declined a little bit, and Snorlax Stall definitely seems to be in a worse spot right now than it has ever been, but Pidgeot Control does seem to be a lot stronger. Now, it did get top 4 at EUIC, hasn't really been able to get that same placement since EUIC. We have seen in a few top 32 since, but I do think that Pidgeot Control really is a strong deck. I just don't think a lot of players are willing to give it the time of day or really just look at the deck, because it does require a lot of thinking and skill. It's a very difficult deck to play properly, and it does have a lot of very strong plays you can make, but very difficult to actually pilot properly, and that's really what holds Pidgeot Control back. I do think this deck can easily get another top 8 if played by the right person and piloted properly. I really do think that this deck is very good. It does seem like it can honestly beat a lot of the big decks right now, and honestly should have a good matchup against Charizard. We just, have to see a good player pilot the deck to a good finish. But I did want to give a quick honorable mention here to Pidgeot Control. And at the number 1 spot, to nobody's surprise, is Charizard EX. Charizard EX is by far and away the best deck in the format right now. It is just so powerful. It's already won 4 tournaments this format. It's just insanely strong and just seems to be unstoppable right now. It really doesn't have like an auto loss. It does have its fair share of like awkward matchups, but I don't think Charizard just flat out loses to anything. Now, there are a few ways actually Charizard is being played right now, not just the more straightforward build here that we are seeing, the Liam Halliburton list from Orlando Regionals. It does seem to be the most common and popular way to play Charizard right now with the Prime Catcher, the Double Charmeleon, but there are a few other builds of Charizard seen some play. Another big build right now is, of course, the Regieleki control build using Eerie with Regieleki. Regieleki is very, very powerful in the Charizard mirror match. And there's also the build of Charizard playing Hero's Cape and Mist Energy, the one that did win Sao Paulo Regionals, also seems to be good. And that might be the more updated, modern way to play Charizard heading in to Indianapolis, because that build does have a lot more text and is a little bit more checked out even for the mirror match with the inclusion of stuff like the Mist Energy. And then, of course, we do have builds of Charizard using stuff like Maximum Belt as their ace spec, which I don't think is as good as Prime Catcher and Hero's Cape, but Max Belt definitely would still see a bit of play right now. There are players, I wouldn't be surprised if you play against a Zard player and sometimes they just happen to play a Maximum Belt within their deck. Even though I think for the mirror match, if you want to play Charizard and you want to beat the mirror, I would ultimately just play the Regieleki build of Charizard over playing just Maximum Belt, because I think Prime Catcher is too good not to play. But yeah, Charizard just BDAF right now. There's a few different ways to play it, more defensive builds, more aggro builds, just stuff like that. Charizard is in a very powerful position right now. It's the BDIF. Wouldn't be surprised if we saw Charizard win Indianapolis. It's just that good of a deck, and there's so many different variations of the deck right now, especially for the different matchup spreads that it has access to. Charizard just seems to be unstoppable, and we'll have to see where it goes for Indianapolis. Like I said, wouldn't be surprised if Charizard did win its 5th tournament this format so far and took down Indianapolis, because it seems to be very good. You just have to pick your poison with what build of Charizard you want to play. Do you want to play the more straightforward build here of Liam and Tort's build? Do you want to play a more control style archetype? with the Regielekis, or do you want to play a little bit more of a defensive build and more stronger build with the Hero's Cape in the deck, or do you want to play a more aggressive build with the Maxim Bell? You just kind of pick your poison. But yeah, Charizard, best deck in the format right now, and definitely is the strongest deck for Indianapolis, hands down. And there you have, folks. Those are the top 10 best decks in the format right now in May of 2024 as we head into the Indianapolis Regionals, which is, of course, this weekend. If you enjoyed the video here on the second channel, leave a like if you enjoyed the top 10 video. Like I said, I haven't done one of these top 10 videos in a while. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe down below, and all that good stuff. And yeah, see you all in another video. Bye-bye.